Good afternoon and welcome to our TV show featuring documentaries revealing the realities behind myths using research and scholarship. I'm your host Ergün Kırlıkovalı and I will be with you every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome to send me your feedback at mythsandrealities.com. The Turkish Armenian Reconciliation Commission efforts to launch a dialogue between Yerevan and Ankara that started in 2001 failed 2 years later in 2003. The TARC process had to be stopped as Armenian ultra-nationalist groups like ANCA have never welcomed the reconciliation process. A valuable opportunity wasted by the aggressive Armenian diaspora had inspired the formation of a new platform in 2003. The Viennese Armenian Turkish platform, or VAT for short. VAT's goal was to mediate between Armenian and Turkish historians in order to scholarly discuss the Turkish-Armenian question concerning the 1915 events. As an Austrian initiative, VAT served from 2003 to 2005 as an intermediary, providing a platform on equal terms. The Turkish Historical Society and the Armenian Academy of Sciences accepted this challenge and agreed to limit their scope of work to the years 1914 through 1919. There is an enormous body of confusing international literature on what had transpired before, during, and after World War I. The state of the art is controversial, polarized, and politicized. As a final outcome, a common handbook was to be published, giving both sides equal opportunity to present their views on this sensitive historical matter. VAT invited both Turkish and Armenian historians to deliver by July 15, 2004, 100 documents that best explained their understanding of 1915 events and validated their position. This was done on time, and the dialogue started. Neither side had any official capacity on behalf of their governments. Turkish historians fielded a formidable array of documents from many sources, Austrian, German, British, French, Russian, while the Armenians limited themselves to the Austro-Hungarian diplomatic communications. The differences were stark. While the Turks were proving beyond a shadow of doubt that the Armenians propagandized, agitated, and terrorized the Ottoman countryside and waged numerous massive bloody revolts during a war of survival for the Ottoman Empire, Armenians generally stuck to expressions of Armenian suffering, saying nothing about the Armenian complicity that caused it. This may explain why Armenians never dared to take Turkey to the International Court of Justice, to have their baseless claim of genocide scrutinized and proven. With such poor documentation, they know they're bound to lose, like they lost at the European Court of Human Rights in 2015, French Constitutional Court in 2012, and the US Federal Court numerous times in the last 20 years. This may also explain why the Armenians failed to open their archives in Yerevan, Istanbul, Jerusalem, Boston, Paris, and elsewhere. The smoking guns of all Armenian hate crimes and war crimes are in those archives, no doubt. No amount of Armenian propaganda can hide the Armenian terrorism, revolts, treason, and the resulting Turkish suffering. Back to VAT. The Turkish media did have a field day with this outcome. News and commentaries proudly expressed how Turks decisively won the battle of documents and Armenian side lost. The Armenian members of VAT used the Turkish media's delighting in success as an excuse to abandon the table. Turkish position has always been to establish a joint Blue Ribbon Historians Commission to research all the relevant archives on the Armenian claims. Addressing the Turkish Grand National Assembly on April 13, 2005, the Turkish Foreign Minister Gül called upon Armenia to accept this Turkish proposal of Commission of Historians. He added that Prime Minister Erdogan had already sent a letter of that to the President, Robert Koçaryan. Armenia was only too quick to reject Turkey's joint study offer. Then on February 12, 2008, at the 44th Munich Security Conference, the Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan verbally repeated the official Turkish offer of establishing a joint investigation committee of historians, looking directly at the Armenian Foreign Minister Oskanian's face, who was among the audience. Again, Armenians rejected the Turkish proposal. VAT gave both sides until the end of 2005 to study the 100 documents submitted by the opposing side. Then, each side was supposed to come back with 80 more documents in response. The document pool would then be locked after that, and all the roundtable discussions would focus on that pool. No new documents would be allowed. The Turkish members of VAT, Professor Halaçoğlu, President of the Turkish Historical Society, and Professor Özdemir, President of the Department of Armenian Studies at the Turkish Historical Society, had, in September 2004, already accepted to participate in the second phase and the roundtable discussions after that. Cancellations came from VAT's Armenian members, namely Professors Barseghian, the director of Genocide Museum in Yerevan, and Melkonian, the director of History Department of the Armenian Academy of Sciences. The first Viennese Armenian Turkish roundtable, thus, unfortunately, never materialized. The first batch of documents already exchanged will now serve as primary sources for the international community. This unsolved historical issue between the two neighboring nations is a huge burden for the region as well as the international community. If this first initiative of VAT had been realized, it would show the world the strong will of both sides to solve their differences amongst themselves. As a side note, I'm happy to note that cordial relations between the two countries' diplomats is taking place as we speak. They held their third Turkish Armenian normalization talks on May 3rd, 2022. Azerbaijan declared open support for this rapprochement. Peace in the region will benefit all three countries, not to mention other Caucasus countries. VAT encouraged both sides to start taking mutual steps towards understanding each other for a common future. I would like to add that such common future must be based on fair memory, shared pain, and respect for each other's suffering, not just Armenians. Let us not forget that the Allies, mainly Britain, France, Russia, and Italy before 1915, Greece and others after 1919, and Armenians both before and after 1919, rained death and destruction upon Turks on Turkish soil. Turks lost about 3 million lives, 500,000 of them at the hands of Armenian revolutionaries. Turks were only defending their homeland. These facts should be acknowledged and respected before any rapprochement effort can be meaningful and successful. VAT finally published the Book of Documents in 2009. There were 179 archival documents from Turkish, American, German, French, and Austrian archives, 99 of them from the Turkish side, 80 from the Armenian side, all from the 1914-1919 period, covering the First World War. Again, a side note. This may be a weakness because this period leaves out all the Armenian revolts, terrorism, treasonous acts, territorial demands, and the resulting Turkish suffering from 1862 to 1915, which play a crucial role in Turkish reactions to Armenian supreme treason. VAT would have been better advised if they could have expanded the time interval to the 60 years starting from 1862 and ending in 1922. That then would cover the first Armenian revolt in Zeytun in 1862 and the last Armenian war crime of torching this beautiful seaside city of Izmir to avoid it from falling into the hands of victorious Turks in 1922. One can also find correspondence of VAT with respective Turkish and Armenian institutions so that the reader can be introduced to VAT process. You can read where you can see how the Armenian scholars used flimsy arguments and absurd excuses to weasel out of their scholarly commitments. The Armenian scholars submitted only the Austro-Hungarian diplomatic communications describing the Ottoman policy towards the Armenians during the World War I. The Armenians could not use their own archives, as those documents would probably contain incriminating evidence of supreme Armenian treason, Armenian war crimes, and hate crimes. They could not use the infamous Blue Book, for example, or Andonian's fake Talat telegrams, or numerous New York Times news and editorials, and many such partisan and propagandist documents, because their sources were all the same. The Armenian insurgents, who used mostly the American missionaries and Western diplomats to spread their embellishments. Turks could effortlessly prove those documents to be one-sided, embellished, falsified, and fabricated. That is probably why the Armenians keep their archives in Yerevan, Istanbul, Jerusalem, Boston, Paris, and elsewhere closed to this date. All this was problematic in many ways. One is that some of those 80 Austrian texts, while on one hand condemned the Ottoman Muslims' excesses against the Armenian deportees, on the other reported on Armenian rebellions and sabotages, labeling the Armenians as separatist troublemakers. Documents number 77, submitted by the Turkish scholars, and number 94, submitted by the Armenian scholars, for example, were one and the same. Turks used it because it reveals the seditious nature of Armenian revolts, and the Armenians used it because it condemned the Muslim excesses on Armenian deportees. This document shows the different ways of interpreting the archival documents by historians. The Turkish side presented 99 powerful and precise documents from the Turkish, Armenian, German, French, and Austrian archives, leaving no room for imagination. The scope and depth of the Turkish documents relate to a large field of content, presented a rich picture of the events, documenting revolts, treason, Armenian war crimes, and Armenian hate crimes, and the serious Armenian threat to the survival of the Ottoman Empire. There's a big difference in the ways the Armenian and the Turkish sides presented their cases, but the body of knowledge in the 179 documents sufficiently corroborate each other. The Turkish side seemed more interested in proving the illegal and subversive nature of the Armenian revolts, while the Armenian side kept repeating the suffering during the Tereset, or temporary resettlement. Armenian suffering was mostly true, but Muslim suffering, mostly Turkish, was much worse, and yet never acknowledged. The Turkish pain was always dismissed in the West out of ethno-religious bias. That is why this is politicized and unresolved for more than a century. During reading this book, one becomes aware of the complexity of the events that formed the backdrop of the Turkish-Armenian conflict. While some readers object to the descriptions and absence of some polarization, antagonism, and enables critical scholars to reflect on different interpretations and form a more just and honest picture of tragedies affecting all Ottoman communities, Muslim and Christian alike, not just Armenians. The documents of the Viennese Armenian Turkish platform can provide an alternative way to answer the campaigns waged by Armenian nationalists. The cancel culture of Armenian lobbyists to label all truth seekers deniers stifles debate and free speech. The Turkish Republic chose the high road of forgive and forget after its establishment in 1923. The Turks, exhausted by endless wars between 1911 and 1922, impoverished and fed up, embarked upon an ambitious program of rebuilding under the visionary leadership of their national hero, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Full of hope and dreams of prosperity, they chose not to teach their K-12 age children the tragic events of Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian revolts, treasons, and atrocities. Generations of Turks grew up knowing little or nothing about Armenian revolts, terrorism, and treason, while Armenians chose to indoctrinate their K-12 children with hatred for all things Turkish. This may explain why there were wave after wave of Armenian terrorism in the past 160 years, but no Turkish retaliation. Turks do not harbor hatred for Armenians, Greeks, or Assyrians, because Turks are not raised as haters. VAT, was an effort to bring scholars and institutions from both sides who could influence their respective policymakers. The collection of documents published in the VAT book tries to encourage an optional way of scholarly understanding of the events of the past. Turkey has long forgotten the First World War. It is now Armenians' turn to stop fighting the World War I. VAT was a private academic initiative to bring the historians with opposite opinions, and both sides were given equal opportunity to present their cases. This is quite in line with the conflict resolution philosophy that parties to a conflict must be brought together around the table, allowed to talk to each other to resolve that conflict. I congratulate Mumcihan and İnanç Atılgan for editing that book, 900 pages of documents. The book was published in 2009 and presents documents put forth during the first phase of the VAT. The second phase had to be cancelled when the Armenian scholars left the table, citing feeble excuses. The real reason must be the credible power of the documents submitted by the Turkish scholars. Coming to terms with their past may be an act of liberation for Armenians from constant cultivation of hatred in their youth, international terrorism, and regional aggressions in the Caucasus region. I find the section from page 27 to 61 useful, as it provides previously unpublished correspondence revealing the gradual realization of Armenian side that there was something nasty in Vienna. My only criticism would be that there was no explanation of how and why those documents were selected by parties and what they really signify. During the VAT proceedings, a momentous event took place. Armenia refused the Turkish Grand National Assembly's invitation of April 13, 2005 to establish joint commission of historians to evaluate the events of the First World War. The Turkish Prime Minister repeated the same invitation at the 44th Security Conference in Munich on February 9, 2008, where the Armenian Foreign Minister Oskanian was present in the audience. There were no preconditions, but the Armenians refused the Turkish offer anyway. If Armenia is so right in her claims, why then is Armenia rejecting a joint historical inquiry? The answer may come from a prominent legal scholar, Bruce Fine's essay titled Armenian Crime Amnesia, published in Washington Times, October 16, 2007. According to Bruce Fine, the director of the Armenian Assembly of America, Bryce Arduni, said, this in a videotaped interview for a documentary on the Armenian revolt. I quote, "We don't need to prove the genocide historically because it has already been accepted politically," unquote. This kind of thinking pretty much summarizes the Armenian attitude towards historical facts. In a scholarly article by another legal scholar, Polat Tajar, and historian Maxim Gain, titled "State Identity, Continuity and Responsibility," published in the European Journal of International Law, August 2012 issue, in response to an Armenian writer's wild claims, Tajar and Gain said this, I quote, "The Armenian question is especially sensitive, among other reasons, because of the long accumulation of prejudices against Turks, Armenian terrorism in 1973-1991 period, the Armenian invasion and occupation of Western Azerbaijan since 1992, and more recently, the virulent anti-Turkish stance of Anders Breivik in his manifesto and the various campaigns or attacks by Armenian nationalists. Instead of easing the tensions, the Armenian writer's article fuels them through the provocative, defaming, and irredentist remarks of its author," unquote. The writers stated their objective as restoring much-needed understanding through a fair and reconciliatory dialogue between the Armenian and Turkish people and all interested parties, including scholars. They supported initiatives for dialogue between antagonists and protagonists. They believed that the creation of a joint commission provided for in the 2009 protocols between Armenia and Turkey would serve the cause of reconciliation. Tajar and Gain focused mainly on the international law aspects of the Turkish-Armenian conflict surrounding the 1915 events and why Turkey does not qualify them as genocide. They stressed that the term genocide is a legal term describing a crime specifically defined by the 1948 Genocide Convention. The existence of the crime of genocide can be legally determined only by the judges of a competent tribunal on the basis of due process and after a fair and impartial trial. Special intent, dolus specialis, must be proven before a genocide verdict. The objective element of a crime, the guilty act, actus reus, is not sufficient. The subjective or mental element, mens rea, must also be proven. This was never done in the alleged genocide case. In summary, that platform may have served Armenians and Turks to find a common ground on mutual suffering, which may have led to a common narrative that is based on fair memory and shared pain. Simplistic pictures of Armenians are good and Turks are bad no longer explains the complexity of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Racist and dishonest labels like genocide denier stifle free speech. What is needed is more research and dialogue, not less. I'm afraid we're out of time this week. Thank you for joining me. See you next week.